we've been going through for several weeks a matter of worldviews, and today I want to focus on at a high level, putting all this into motion and actually talking to people and evangelizing and that sort of thing. And I'm going to keep it pretty high level. I know at some point I did a presentation, but it may not have been here, that was very detailed on some of the issues that today we'll cover high level. So I'm able to fish that up and do that at some point. But it really helps to do a little bit of resetting our thinking, I think, about evangelism, and that's kind of a part of my goal here with this. And when I say that, this isn't about changing the message, but let's just kind of walk through it. We spent a lot of time about trying to understand how our culture thinks, not with the idea that everybody thinks the same way, but we can understand through the lens of Romans 1, through the lens of Genesis 3, that when you try to explain the world or reality apart from God, you necessarily have to be reductionistic. You end up leaving something out. That creates inconsistencies, and typically, because you've left something out, your worldview really doesn't have the explanatory power you need, and you can't live it out consistently. It just creates all kinds of problems. Now, we talked about a lot of isms, but it's not necessarily that every person would fit into one of those. It's more often the case, particularly today, that people pick elements of those different isms. At times, they're the same person will tell you, follow the science, and then the other times they'll tell you something that's completely unscientific that they wholeheartedly believe. And that's how people are. We can hold to inconsistent beliefs, but people tend to be a hodgepodge. But the common thread through it is what you see in Romans 1, that truth gets suppressed. People may not realize they're doing that. I'm not saying they always know they're doing it, but nevertheless, part of reality has been suppressed. And it usually starts off with the part about God. Uh, and either his existence altogether, or if people are willing to admit there's some greater power, that's about as far as it goes. And so it's still reductionistic, and that's our culture. But the slide I didn't show last time, and I don't have it here, was just to say, we're in a postmodern, or even maybe after the postmodern era, and you need to understand in the United States that it's very common that there's folks who, whose families have been in the United States for a long time. So I'm not thinking of recent immigrants who could have a very different cultural background, but they're a few generations removed from a time when their family either was church going or at least had a more biblical mindset, even if they weren't church going. It's common now for younger generations to have never, I mean, they know what the word Bible means, they have some idea of that, but they've never opened one. And things we might take for granted, words we might use that are good Bible and church words, they wouldn't really understand them. So we want to understand our audience, but with all that said, uh, let's be practical about how we can engage people in a way that can be successful. So this first slide is just a high level. I'm going to have a slide on each of these points here in a minute, but to evangelize in 2026, one of the first things is we have to recognize cultural issues. And that would be true of going anywhere in the world. I've always laughed a little bit at seeing some old missionary photographs of American missionaries in their, particularly in the past and from certain, like strict Baptist backgrounds, out there in their suit and tie in the middle of some remote village that doesn't have electricity, and how they stand out from that culture when really what they probably should be doing is dressing like the people in the culture and kind of blending in. But it kind of illustrates something like we can be that person that is just so um, out of touch. And I'm not talking about being like the culture in its thinking and morality, But we have to know the culture. And I think a lot of times people don't. And I'll give an example here in this first bullet. But in the United States, knocking on doors used to be a very popular way to evangelize. And I'm not going to try to dissuade anybody from doing that. I think it generally doesn't work. Things have changed. Even in the 70s when I was growing up, we didn't always have the doors locked. You didn't have much concern that somebody who wasn't welcome was going to burst through the door. And people knocked on doors. People knocked on doors to sell stuff. You may not want to buy anything, but you weren't fearful to go open your door because someone had knocked on it that you didn't know. The lady selling Avon was a regular around my house, coming as when I was a child, and other people would come along. They wanted to sell vacuum cleaners, and some of them wanted to talk about the Bible. But today, that really usually doesn't work. And it doesn't work, for maybe a host of reasons. Doesn't make it wrong, but I know folks who will talk about, well, we're meeting on X day to go soul winning, which they mean knock on doors, and they do this. And I'm not going to say they never have some success. I'm going to say for the most part they don't. And all I'm asking is if the culture's changed, there may be a better way to approach people than knocking on the door to somebody you don't know and asking them if, have they thought about what would happen if they died today? That actually usually sets up a wall between you and that person you don't know rather than opening a door. But and I know some people can find this offensive because they've been raised, that's what you did. Soul winning was knocking on doors. But the numbers show it's usually not effective. Now, I'm talking about our culture in the United States. Now this has been 20 years ago, but we had a Spanish-speaking church plant as part of the church I was at and on staff on for a while. In the Spanish-speaking church, they were finding that going around to in an area whose demographic was largely Spanish speaking, knocking on doors, someone who actually spoke Spanish, was effective. But when we did the same thing in the English speaking areas, it never was. And so this is a cultural thing. There could be, places where this would work. I have been told by missionaries in some foreign countries, particularly I remember hearing some from like India, about just setting up just sort of street preaching and actually gathering a big crowd that listens and having people saved from standing up and presenting the gospel. I see street preachers in downtown Houston from time to time. They set up megaphones and talk into a speaker from a public corner. And one, I can hardly tell what they're saying, but I don't think they're actually being effective. I can't say, they've never been effective, but people aren't, joining a crowd around them to listen. They're just sort of ignoring them. And so we need to think about, culturally, what's the best way to engage people in conversations? What may have worked in a different time, or what might today work in a different culture? Will it work in the culture I'm in? Yeah, that's a question we have to ask. Consider what evangelism really is and what it's not. I'm going to come back to that. I think a lot of the people that are churchgoers don't evangelize, and I think the reason they don't do it is probably twofold. They have a wrong view about what evangelism really is, and they're hiding. And so we'll come back and kind of talk about that. By hiding, I mean sometimes it's the idea that, well, evangelism will happen when people who are lost come to church because we're going to make sure the pastor we hired gives the gospel every week, and that's our evangelism. So we're going to come back to this. Know the audience, which is kind of like the culture, but when we say, know the audience, um, Paul knew the audience in Acts 17, and it's really telling, and really in all of his sermons, he knows his audience. You see the same thing reflected in Peter in the book of Acts when he preaches. Um, Having that idea of the way people think. That's why we had this groundwork from before, not to pigeonhole people, but just to have some idea where people are coming from. A lot of young people in our culture today, their concept of truth is based largely on feelings. You need to know that as you engage them. But if you were to engage a Muslim audience, and I'll mention a book later, you're engaging in an entirely different worldview. And it would help to know something about it, before you do it. Sometimes you don't have that benefit. You may find yourself in a conversation with somebody and you don't really know a lot about where they're coming from because they have this or that background. Um, but it does help when we're able to have a little bit of understanding where people are coming from. We got to learn to ask questions and be good listeners. We think of evangelism in terms of imparting information, but frankly, a lot of evangelism is what we might call pre-evangelism. We need to have good conversations with people. Um, Objections concern people. How will I answer this or that objection? I think we overstate that problem. I love objections because they open up an opportunity. As long as you avoid the idea that you're going to debate somebody, they open up the opportunity to really dialogue and have a good conversation. You just have to handle it in the right way and not make it about trying to like win an argument because that's no good. We already know we have the winning argument. What I'm trying to do is help people see in their the shortcomings of their own perspective when they have an objection. So we'll think a little about that. Um, just to pause for a second about objections. What are the kind of common objections you think people have to Christianity?
Um, maybe they think it's um, bigoted
Hmm.
because of really it's a straw man. Most people have in their mind a straw man of what Christianity is.
I think that may be true. That is, I'm not saying it's intentional, just that their understanding could be incomplete. It could also be shaped by having met some particularly ornery Christians, right? Dart?
Uh, I think the some of the biggest issues I've had is people are reacting to the negative churches out there. And
Mhm.
there are wonderful churches out there, but so many of them are just embarrassing. And those are the ones that make the news.
Yeah,
Those are the ones that are on CNN. This crazy church did this, did that. The good churches don't do that and they're not getting out there. But people were like, "What? You're a Christian? What?"
yeah,
And you've got so many crazy things out there and intolerant churches, and I think that's a big turnoff.
yes. Yes, churches. I've always said that a lot of the so-called Christian leaders you see on national media, I tell people everything they said doesn't represent me at all. And I'm not going to name names, 'cause I'll end up upsetting somebody because I might name one of your heroes. But I'm just telling you, there are some dumb people that the news outlets love to put them up because if you can just put them up there and let them talk they cause damage, and we have to deal with that. Remember, some people have really been hurt at a church, and we have to be sensitive to that. Cheryl?
I think a lot of it also is the fact that they don't understand that there is actual proof out there. There is actual concrete proof on the basis of Christianity. And my experience is just in watching some programs on television, which a couple of them really highly annoy me. They caricature Christianity as basically stupid. And not only stupid, but they portray it as something that it's not. And I think a lot of people don't really understand what Christianity really is and what it really means. They've listened to all the crap that's out there. So again, I think
Yeah.
one of the big things is that they don't think there's really any proof for it.
Yeah. I
And they
think you
feel that people
go
are
ahead.
weak, that are Christians, that we're
Yeah.
weak.
Weak-minded because we follow something that has no proof. I think, Cheryl, what you're identifying may be the single biggest issue it is we need to recognize this. Our culture widely believes, and unfortunately, a number of Christians believe that we simply have believed something out of almost an arbitrary choice. It in some way feels beneficial to us, or it's a crutch, but it is in no way based on evidence. It's in no way historically grounded or factually grounded. That's a misconception, but Christians have done way too much to bolster that rather than to disprove it. And so that's something that we have to think about in our evangelism. Judd,
Me,
oh, is it Winnie?
I, I've got to 50. I must have got to 50 churches waiting in the car. And I thought very graceful. And I got down to group and
Can't hear her.
Yeah, Winnie, it's cutting in and out a little bit. May just be the reception where you're at. Yep, it's still cutting in and out. Winnie, if the reception gets back gets a little better, just yeah, speak up. But we were barely able to hear you. Carol?
Well, I believe that a lot of my friends that aren't Christians believe that people are basically good when we
Mhm.
know that that's not true.
Yep.
And they feel that they don't need Christianity to get to heaven. They do good works. They feel like their good works will get them to heaven.
Yeah.
And yeah, they don't understand. So it's sad.
Well,
Very sad.
and what that gets to is as Christians, we need to make sure we understand the fundamentals of the faith and sort of number one when in the terms of evangelism is we are sinners. We're not fundamentally good. And I would submit that's an area that opens up an easy way to point to the evidence. We've covered this a little bit in one of the prior lessons, but historical evidence just shows over and again that we have a real problem, and you can't go a week watching the news without seeing just killings that have no good reason at all. There's a reason always, but it's often just, I mean, somebody got their order wrong at the McDonald's or whatever, just these absurd things, and then you say, well, oh, they must have been mentally ill. No, they're not. It's who we are. Anyway, so as Christians, we need to be able to show our worldview and show it's historically and factually grounded. Um, yeah. So uh, Mark,
Yeah, I would just agree with the other comments. And
yeah,
I think just over the last 30, maybe even 40 years, um, that the way the education system has been, the way that, I mean, there's just been a lot of reinforcement that has suppressed and marginalized Christian values, Christian beliefs, to the point now where we have a whole generation of people that have been almost brainwashed into believing something that's not true about Christianity. So,
yes,
yeah, we've got a huge mountain to climb just to get people to um, be open to the idea that there's a legitimacy to Christian belief systems.
yeah. And what's interesting is that what we've seen a little bit of, sort of with folks like Charlie Kirk and others, there's kind of a generation of these younger apologists who have opened some cracks in made some cracks in the door because while the caricature of Christianity has done a lot of damage, and while I think, and someone said it earlier, I think maybe it was Dark, there's some weird churches that I mean, because people have good reason sometimes to believe this stuff about Christianity. Now they're not basing it on a composite. They're basing it on the weird stories, the stuff that makes headlines. But it hasn't helped, right? There's been a Catholic Church scandal for years, but the reality is it's come out that it's been a problem among the Southern Baptists, the Independent Baptists, and basically every other group of molesting children and stuff and other sexual issues. I mean, these things have not helped. So people aren't completely off base to have some of those views. It's still not correct, but you can understand where they're coming from. And of course, media has done a lot to do that. Yeah, we have a generation where we're almost starting from a clean slate from the standpoint that they don't have some background in if I talked about Moses, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But we have a challenge, not a clean slate from the perspective of maybe having to deal with some preconceptions that are wrong. But we want to think about how we do that. Cheryl?
I think you mentioned Charlie Kirk. I think Charlie Kirk was so effective is because he met them where they were and he listened to them and he had empathy. He treated them with respect.
Hmm.
Again, of course, he asked the questions, but again, he made a connection with them.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your thinking about knowing the culture and knowing where these individual people really are residing,
Mhm.
and the sense that you're meeting them there, just like Christ met each one of us where we are. That is what he does, and that's what he did. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's why he died.
Well, but it does help, I'm no expert on Charlie Kirk's. I haven't watched a lot of it. I watched a few videos, and he did what you described, and he did it in a gracious way, and but he asked questions and sort of steered people to see the inconsistency in their own reasoning, or as was so often the case with younger people, because of the referenced lack of education, even people that have a diploma on their wall don't know what an argument is. They think that whatever they feel, that sort of makes it true, and so all they're doing is they're angry and they know how to use colorful language, but they don't have an argument. He helped them see that, at least some people, not everybody will listen, but you did that. And there's a lot of other people doing the same thing. There's a younger generation of apologists that are engaging in those kinds of conversations. They're not so much focused on explaining the age of the earth and those kinds of things, which I think have their place, and dealing with Darwinianism and stuff, and that has its place. But they're focused on these conversations and how they happen and how you can steer them, because the reductionism, all these other isms we've seen, they are the Achilles heels of folks' worldviews, and they're the path through which we can, in a proper way, help people see that their worldview, and ultimately a worldview is a religion, and theirs doesn't have good explanatory power. And I think what's been keyed in on is, despite being told that they have everything figured out, they're realizing they're terribly unhappy. It's the proof's in the pudding kind of thing. There's widespread, and sort of growing issues of depression and different things like that people are feeling empty, and they're at least starting to question, maybe there's something I haven't thought about, or some other way that wouldn't lead to this. I would also mention, just again as an example, and I know in a lot of circles you're not supposed to mention this person, but Ravi Zacharias, if you we found out that, to our great surprise, that he wasn't as perfect as all of us before he passed away. But if you watch a video of him, dealing with skeptics at his presentations, he's extraordinary. He's an older generation that and it doesn't mean he changed everybody's mind, but he handled it with graciousness, and he was very clever and educated and that kind of thing, but just handled it with graciousness. Even people who, it won't always work, but a lot of times it will. Even when their question out of the box is just the tone and everything about it's anger, he dealt with it well. I'd highly recommend if you've never watched him do that, you should see it. And I think a lot of his books are very helpful. I mean, because um, of having some focus about how to talk with people, not just knowing the answers. So culture matters. It shapes how best to approach an evangelistic conversation, and the culture derives from worldviews. So we need to know something about our culture, and I think for most of us, that's going to be the culture here. But it is a different thing if we're in the Philippines or in China or some other place, or even a lot of parts of Europe, they're like us, but there's differences too, and all these things matter. But what's effective one place may not be effective in another. I mentioned that. Patterns of evangelism from back in the day that worked may no longer be effective. They might be. It depends where you're at and who you're talking to. What we don't want to do is keep repeating what doesn't work so that we can say we've sort of given it the college try. I'd rather ask the question of what is most effective. The reality is, for example, in church growth, and I've heard this from numerous people that are doing it, is that there's a lot of churches that are growing more from evangelism than just picking off people from other churches. And they're doing it through a small group approach that gets, and, among younger people especially, that gets people to come to small groups, and then they sort of graduate to becoming part of the gathering of the church on Sunday mornings. Just saying, that wasn't a thing, decades ago, that to my knowledge, it certainly wasn't a common thing. It's more than just a house church. So that's been around a long time, but it's just a way of younger people want to socialize, and this usually is a good door, an open door to a church setting that's been effective. But I'm just saying it's something that's matching the culture. And one person I sat by on, I've mentioned this before, on airplanes, I always get seated by somebody that needs to have this conversation. And this was a young pastor that had taken over a uh, Korean church of primarily Korean immigrants to Los Angeles, and I think it was Los Angeles, definitely California, and it had dwindled down before he took it over, and then it had over like a 2 year period of time, it had gone from like less than 50 people to like a couple of hundred through these life groups or these home groups. Um, and it was highly effective in that culture. And so they're reaching young people. They do have a common cultural background, and that helps give people some connection point. And it's through evangelism. And I'm going to mention someone else later that does the same thing and make a book recommendation. Building relationships, though, has always been effective. I think Cheryl mentioned earlier, Jesus was getting in people's lives, and we get snapshots, but we shouldn't assume that all these things just like happen in 10 minutes just because we can read the passage in 10 minutes. Jesus went out of his way to build bridges with lost people, like that little guy Zacchaeus that he went over to his house, that kind of thing. And he did that. And a lot of times I think it's not that many of us are unwilling to do that, but we're often not doing it, and it can be for a lot of reasons. But we can, like one way it can happen is we can be so busy in doing every activity a church has available that there's not a time outside of work and church where we can plant ourselves in a different setting to meet those people, to meet Zacchaeus and that kind of thing. Um, there's a wonderful book I read. Let me think of her name real quick. That just really illustrates this. And now I'm trying to. What is her name? Jeez, I'm gonna see if I can find it real quick. But anyway, let me say this because the illustration will work without the name, but it will come to me. Um, she wrote a book after she got saved, but this lady was a lesbian professor at a leading university in literature and maybe classics, but it was literature for sure. And she lived next door to a Presbyterian preacher. It was either next door or like just down the street, like really close. And he had written some kind of article in the paper, like an editorial kind of thing. And of course, she didn't like it, and she wrote him a nasty gram. He invited her to have supper at their house.
Butterfield,
Yes, that's it. What's her first name?
Rosaria or
Yeah,
Rosa?
Rosaria Butterfield, and she's got a few books, and it's a very insightful book and worth reading, and it's her first book that's a little bit autobiographical about her. You know, she ended up getting married later to a different Presbyterian preacher, and she ended up adopting children, and so she's had a fascinating life. I don't agree with her theological and everything. I'll say that, but it doesn't take away from the book. And the point is though, this preacher, getting a letter from someone of a very different worldview, disagreeing with everything, invited her to have a conversation. And she didn't get saved that day. That's the other story that is important. This happened over time. It led to her being invited to dinner, becoming a common dinner guest. She sat with him and his wife, and she found out that Christianity wasn't what she thought it was, and these people weren't who she thought they would be. And she found out that they didn't hate her. But this guy took that step. And along the journey, this guy asked her, knowing she teaches, because I thought she might have teach some classics or something. He wanted to give a lecture in one of her classes that would overview the Bible, the whole Bible in a single lecture, because it's ancient literature and they should know about it. And she says, "Well, maybe I would let you do that, but you need to give me the lecture first." You can see where that went. And and she started, it didn't, it took time, but he gave her in her office the 1 hour through the whole Bible lecture. So just saying, it's just, evangelism is usually comes down to building these relationships, and we can hide either because, like me, a complete introvert, would prefer not to be around a crowd in general unless I have a very specific purpose, like I do now. Uh, or we're so busy hiding in church. I don't mean that in a bad, negative way. We're just involved in it, and we're busy from a lot of other angles. But somehow we don't find the time to plant ourselves where you're going to be required to meet and talk with lost people. And so we need to think about how we can do that, because that goes in with this being effective. What can I do to position myself? A lot of people never thought about it, and we overthink it too. There could be joining a club that you're personally interested in joining, right? Like those things are out there. There's any number of, I live in a rural area, there's any number of clubs that meet. There's one that's graduates from Texas A&M University that meet in the area once a month. And then there's another club that I went to for a while that was like the county's Republican club, and they often would have guest speakers that are local congressmen and things that were interesting. And you plant yourself in there, and you'll be around some people who aren't believers. A car club because you're a vintage car person, or my wife goes to this thing where they do these competitions that are you get in teams and you're putting puzzles together and there's a prize to be won, but you're in things where there are people you can talk to. For a lot of people that still have young children, we waste opportunities down at the ball field at Little League where we could engage people a little better. But that's another avenue where you're around people who aren't believers necessarily, and it allows you to do that. So you have to think, actively, how can I get out of my comfort zone and plant myself? And it could be something you like to do, but just it's going to be around other people. And the greatest evangelist I ever personally knew, I mean, personally knew him. This guy was an evangelism machine. He just lived and breathed it. But in his old age, at least in his mid 70s, he got a job. He was a retired carpenter, but he got a job refurbishing a lot of stuff in a fairly large facility that was for teenagers. It had like a little bowling alley and laser tag and an arcade and all these things. And that man used that job to generate conversations with teenagers, and he was effective. Okay, he was, and then there was it was a great story when the place had a natural gas leak, and the firemen showed up, and the place was full of gas. No one could explain it. The fireman didn't know why he wasn't dead because he's in there lighting a fire and heating up his coffee, and they drag him out. They said this place is full of natural gas. Then he starts evangelizing the firemen. But it was just the way he lived. But he intentionally did something that most people at his age would never have done. He went and got a job at a place because he knew there would be young people everywhere he could engage in conversations. Just a good lesson. What is evangelism anyway? Many Christians have been indoctrinated with certain methods, Romans road tracks and the like. And I'm not here to say all that stuff is bad. That's the misunderstanding. But it can having these tools and methods can kind of convince us that that's evangelism. I mean, giving someone a tract, that's my like I'm out there, that's my job. I need to give tracts to people. Giving a tract may be helpful. Now, most of the time, that tract's getting thrown away. It's not effective like it used to be. I'm not saying it's never effective. I know people that have wonderful testimonies about how they got saved through a tract. It happens. But most of the time, that's not what happens. But if I think that evangelism is handing out tracts, you see, I'm getting myself kind of off. And so sometimes, based on these tools and methods, which, a tract and the Romans road and that, it's all around sort of giving an elevator speech with the gospel. And and we can be led to think that if I engage with somebody in a conversation and I don't share the gospel with them, I haven't evangelized. And that's not true. Jesus had pre-evangelism conversations. He talked to that rich young lawyer guy that said, "I've done everything, and I just want to follow you. What else do I have to do to get eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, give all your stuff away and come follow me." He's not telling them to be saved by works, and it's sort of absurd to hear people butcher that passage. He's pre-evangelizing that this guy wasn't as perfect as he thought he was. And although he probably really had done all these things, and Jesus was showing him that if it's about works, you haven't really done it. So we need to be careful about thinking of evangelism only in terms of sharing the gospel. It's not really a biblical thinking. And I also don't think it's the most effective means of reaching people. I asked the question here in the third bullet, do the tools and methods create anxiety that prevents us from evangelizing? If I think of the gospel in soul winning and evangelizing solely in terms of going and knocking on doors of people I don't know, who in my neighborhood are armed, or of passing around tracts, or just walking up to people I've never met and asking them, do they know where they would be if they died today? You know, I don't, I am afraid to do that. I don't want to do that. It's also very rarely effective. But what if evangelism simply flowed spontaneously out of natural conversations with people that need Jesus? And what if we redefine success to really be any conversation where I get an opportunity to point people to Jesus in some way? Not, it doesn't even necessarily get to presenting the gospel. I hope it will, and sometimes it will. It's a timing issue. But sometimes it's just getting people to think about whether they need a God, right? Uh, because I've mentioned before, trying to work through a book I want to publish on why we need the God of the Bible. Most people in our culture don't know why they need God. And so when we start saying you need to be saved, they have no idea what we mean by getting saved or why they need saving or what they need saving from. We just sound like gibberish. So people need to know. But rethinking evangelism so that you don't get tied up in this idea that if I don't do exactly this or that and say this or that in the right way or use some formulaic approach, that if I don't do those things, I haven't evangelized. We don't want to think that way. Um, One of my sit-down conversations on the airplane was with a man who, and I think I have this in a later bullet, but is historically been a common practice for me to open up a physical Bible. A lot of people have Bibles on their phone and all that. Get a real Bible, and if you'll open it up in front of people sometime, it's amazing what happens. And on the airplanes, people ask me questions. Almost every time. All I do is open up the book and they ask me a question about it. Like, that wasn't hard. And you know where I learned this, by the way? It was flying to Salt Lake City. You fly to Salt Lake City, and it won't be a Bible that they're opening, but half the crowd will have their book in front of them. And I thought about that, and I said, why don't Christians do that? And besides that, I got to pass the time. What am I just going to watch the screen in the seat in front of me? If I don't have to work, let me open the Bible. And this man had questions. He was a man that had built a large business, and for all that success, he just couldn't um, deal with his teenagers. He didn't know what to do. They was having all kinds of problems. I mean, there's a hurt there and questions about, well, what can I do to, he feel like he's losing his children. And I'm just saying that, and so he asked these questions. Um, and so that conversation wasn't me jumping to the gospel presentation. It was me talking to him about children, but talking from a biblical perspective and seeing I had a Bible open. He was sort of open to my talking about the Bible, and it's a place to start. Um, Strongly recommended book. I should have put an apostrophe here because his name is Ed Wakin, so it'd be apostrophe S here. His book, he's a free grace guy, by the way, and I had him as a professor. I don't remember what the class was called, but I think it was evangelism class. But his book, Wildfire, The Fearless Spread of the Gospel, is just outstanding. And he approaches and builds out thoroughly what I was suggesting about a more natural approach to evangelism. And he talks about it just sort of flowing out of our love for people and being spontaneous, relying on the Holy Spirit to give you the words you need at the moment. Don't have a script. Tracks aren't necessarily bad, but you can get away from that and just talk with people and how it frees us up to have an evangelistic lifestyle because we're not tethered to this old idea that if I don't close the deal, I haven't evangelized, or if I don't, present the Romans road, I haven't done my job. And anyway, it's very good. Any conversation that sows seeds, that gets people to start thinking, for example, that the Bible is true, or as someone mentioned earlier, people think there's no evidence. I hear that all the time. And the reason I hear it is they're wondering why somebody with advanced degree in mathematics and a law degree where law is all about evidence would believe things they have no evidence. And I'm like, I always tell people, and it's like a deer in the headlights with a light, their eyes. I'm like, Christianity's got gobs of evidence. But what led you to believe that it didn't? Like, what specifically led you to believe that Christianity doesn't have evidence? I mean, it's just a natural question, and you get people talking. We need to have those conversations that sow seeds, and it can be done in any of a number of ways. As I mentioned, one of those conversations was really me talking about what the Bible says about raising children, but that was a way of sowing seeds. Years ago, I had somebody who I'd not talked to about church stuff ever in the workplace, but she knew I was a Christian. I'm going to come back to that point and talk about it here in a moment. But she came to ask me because um, either her mother or father had either just passed or it was imminent, and she wanted to know whether it was appropriate to oh, what's the word I'm missing? Cremation. Like that was her question. But here's somebody coming to me because she recognizes me as a Christian and she's not shown that interest in it, and she asked the question. Now, I taught a Bible study at the workplace. After that conversation, she started attending. Just saying, it started something. I don't know. Uh, the ending of the story. I just know that for some period of time, I was able to talk to somebody once a week about the Bible. Jesus promised the Holy Spirit would give us the words to say. That's in a few places. Matthew 10 is one of them. Sometimes evangelism is closing the deal. We often think of someone like Billy Graham, and I don't want to get into right now, some concerns about, him mixing repentance of sins and all that. But the fact is, I have met a number of people that would give a testimony that they were saved at a Billy Graham crusade. And I think they were. And the point is, he was more of a deal closer in that way. People would get, and a lot of these people would told me, I didn't want to go. Grandma made me go. And he presented a compelling message, but he closed the deal. We're not always going to be deal closers. Sometimes we will. And sometimes that'll be because someone else sowed seeds that now this person's in a position we could present the gospel. They may have had the gospel presented 10 times before. This is the time the deal's going to get closed. I don't want to say that we're never about closing the deal, but I don't want to measure my success into whether I get to close the deal and feel like I'm a failure if I don't. This Nabil Qureshi book is an outstanding book for a number of reasons. One is to get a bit of a Muslim perspective. He's raised in the United States. His father was a military officer, so he moved around a lot, and he's was Muslim. Okay, now he became a Christian, and he wrote a few books. He became a bit of an apologist. This gentleman went to medical school. He ended up passing away in Houston not a terribly long time ago. It's probably been a decade or more, but he got into cancer, kind of passed away fairly young. The book's fascinating, and part of the fascination is he meets a guy at college as an undergraduate. It's his dorm buddy or whatever, who is not only a Christian, but he can defend the faith. And he certainly wasn't ignorant of the Bible and wasn't entirely ignorant of Islam. But it was this guy didn't get saved in a one-time meeting or even over a year. Like it took time, but the key to it, this man formed a genuine friendship with Nabil. They could still be friends if Nabil didn't ever become a Christian, but the friendship earned the right to talk. And Nabil, of course, as a lot of Muslims are, they believe that they know something about the Bible that Christians don't know. And so he was willing to engage in these conversations. And over a long time, Nabil did become a Christian. It's a fascinating story. But that's how a lot of evangelism works. It's not just a one-time encounter. It could be, but I think that's more the exception than the rule. We already talked about knowing your audience, and sometimes I think our circle, being limited to church folks, can sort of block our understanding of and get us a bit out of touch with our prevailing culture. Our study over the past several weeks was designed to really, help us think about worldviews and Romans 1, not to pigeonhole people. Oh, you're one of those. No, not that. I'm trying to figure out through a conversation and clues and what they say where they're coming from, because it might guide a little bit about where I try to steer a conversation. Okay. And if you talk with people long enough, you'll get an idea of their worldview because they're happy to tell you. Almost everybody wants to tell you what they think. Our mistake sometimes is wanting to tell people what we think when we need to be asking questions and letting them talk in these evangelistic conversations, because you build trust just by showing people you're listening, giving responses that ask about what they just told you, because then they're recognizing you listened to what I said. You placed value on me. And that opens up the possibility for that conversation. We need to be people that ask good questions. I mentioned already, sort of rethinking this idea of evangelism. Um, there has to be a lot more groundwork in our culture usually, so that we can't go immediately to the punchline. And that punchline might be several conversations down the road. There was someone here locally who was a church planner. He's moved on after he planted the church, but in my little rural area, the church grew very rapidly to, several hundred people, which is a lot in a rural area over a few years. And he talked a lot about evangelism and building friendships and earning the right to be earned. And he told a very fascinating testimony about someone he did eventually evangelize. It was a Jewish couple, but it really, he formed a friendship, and not just with sort of like, it's a bait and switch. I really just want a chance to give you the gospel. He formed a friendship, and it proceeded over an extended period. But there is something to this idea of earning the right to be heard, where they trust you enough. They think you care about them, right? They believe you care about them, and so you have something to say. This is another book. I'm possibly distantly related to this gentleman because my great grandmother's last name was Hudson. That's how I got my first name. And my family and this man's family are from the same rural area, so there's some connection there way back in the day. But in any event, Lester Hudson's a pastor I had for a long time. In the 60s, on the way to church to give his sermon, he had a head-on collision with a large truck, landed out on the road, got ran over, and lived to tell about it. But he spent 6 months or more in a body cast, laying in a bed. And he had this idea for writing this book, which he wrote. Now it's in multiple languages. Thousands of people have been saved. But the way this happened, though, what the book is it's not how to go out and just talk to somebody, but if you could get someone to a point where you would ask them, what if we met once a week for 6 weeks, just an hour each time, and we just sort of work through what the Bible says about Jesus Christ and the gospel, that kind of thing. It's very basic, and it's why he calls it basic Bible truths. And by the way, it's free grace friendly, so there's no repent of all your sins or nonsense. But it's 6 lessons, and it's designed so that you would sit down across the table in somebody's home and just do a 1 hour lesson. It's in an area where they're perfectly safe because you're in their home, you're their guest, and lots of people have come to Christ through this. Now, there's some relationship building first to get the trust to be able to say, "Hey, can we do this?" But then it gives you a nice, just a clean way of talking through, the facts. We are sinners. We need saving. We can't save ourselves through works, that kind of thing. Dan?
Yeah, Brother Lester recorded the basic Bible truths as YouTube videos now,
Ah, well,
and
good.
he's personally doing it himself. So they just got uploaded like a month ago. So
And it's been translated into Spanish and Russian and maybe something else. Um, and anyway, it's been highly effective. Now, this isn't like I said, it's for a situation where you could get someone to come down to either meet in your home or you meet in their home and talk to them. And it's just 6 1 hour Bible lessons, but it allows people to go through Bible verses that aren't hard. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that kind of thing. And of course, John 3:16, very effective. Um, Ask good questions. Best book I've read out there about asking questions is Greg Kuchel's book. I know I've mentioned a number of times, but I wanted to put it on the slide. I read it as, I say read it. I listened to it. It is available as an audio book. It's quite good, and it's got like there's like a 10th anniversary edition or something. It's a minor, but he covers in detail, but in the most practical terms, ideas about how to start a conversation with people and how to ask questions and how to deal with some common responses that bog us down. And I don't remember all of them now, but it's just the idea that sometimes, I found this talking to Calvinists. If I start getting the context around a passage built up, they'll move the goalposts and talk about another passage because they don't want to get cornered in on that one. Well, people in general are like that, and he kind of addresses that, like how to deal with that. It is simply an excellent book. He has another book that's also good. That's sort of a lecture he does. That's kind of like the one I mentioned earlier, where he, with a pastor wanted to present the gospel in an hour. He kind of presents the story of the Bible in an hour or two, that kind of thing. because that sometimes is very effective. That assumes you've already got an audience to listen. But this book was super helpful. Questions like, have you ever thought about, just these aren't, there's no rocket science to it, by the way. When you look at it, it's obvious. But what he does a good job of, there are common responses that he's found sort of in it by just by experience. Here's a best way to try to deal with that because you don't want the conversation to sort of go off on a tangent, nor do you want to be monopolizing it. So it's that kind of thing. Most conversations don't start with these kinds of questions. They start with natural introductions that fit the situation. But I think we all do have, if we look back on it, we've all probably had opportunities where we thought later, I could have said more. I could have driven that in a little different direction. And I think reading through a book like this kind of helps you get a little attuned to when a door is opened or a crack is opened. Again, not to necessarily run the ball all the way to the end zone because that sometimes doesn't help. But to begin that conversation, I've mentioned before that one of those times I had the Bible open on an airplane, one of the ladies that works for the airline sat down next to me to ask a Bible question. That sometimes that happens. I think though that you'd be surprised when you ask people some questions how it could lead to a nice positive conversation about things. Anyway, well, that brings me to the end of it. I know this was super high level, but also I hope if if you're a reader or listen to audiobooks, think about these books, particularly this one I just mentioned, and the Wildfire book. The Wildfire book is to help give you a different vantage point on what evangelism really is. Tactics is a great book for just thinking about talking to people and making sure we can have those good conversations. Any closing thought or question before we adjourn? Okay. I'm going to stop the recording here.